Welcome, friends. My name is Maddie Rose. I use she, her pronouns, and I am on staff here at Pendle Hill. It is my pleasure and honor to host our August 2025 First Monday lecture. Thank you all for being here. Pendle Hill is located on Lenape land on what is now known as Wallingford, Pennsylvania. And as many of you know, since 1930, Pendle Hill has been an experiment in spiritual learning community. Hello to our leaders, our alumni, those who are new to us tonight. And hello to everyone on Zoom, those who may be watching on YouTube or in the future. Thank you for being here. Before I say a little bit more about our program tonight, I'm going to go over some technical details. I'm joined tonight by Pendle Hill staff and guests, including Francis and Olivia, who are assisting with tech. If you have any technical difficulties or questions tonight, please message the person whose name is Asterix Tech Host, and they will do their best to support you. A few other notes. We are currently live streaming this video on our YouTube channel, Pendle Hill USA, but only those speaking and spotlit will be live streamed. And in the coming days, we will send out a link to this recording as well as the resources that are shared tonight. We have also enabled live transcription, so we invite you to access closed captioning if you would like on your device. And finally, at the end of the lecture, we will have an opportunity for our speakers to answer some questions. So we invite you at any time between now and then to add your questions. There is a Q&A function, a Q&A box on your screen that should allow you to ask questions. And if you have any trouble with that, again, you can message the person whose name is Asterix Tech Support, which is my coworker Francis, and we will do our best to help you. We are especially grateful to Friends Foundation for the Aging, whose support to Pendle Hill allows us to continue making our First Monday lecture series and other online offerings free to friends of all ages. August 6th and 9th, 2025 mark 80 years since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tonight's First Monday lecture is dedicated to the humanitarian and health impacts of nuclear weapons, testimonies from Hibakusha and other impacted communities, and the role of faith communities in working to abolish these weapons. We hope you will leave this program tonight with concrete ideas for how to take action locally and internationally. I'm delighted now to introduce our speakers for tonight, who I have the pleasure to work with in my previous role where I was advocating for nuclear disarmament. Molly McGinty is the Program Director with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW, where she coordinates the Federation's initiatives on the humanitarian and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons and advocates for their total abolition, primarily through the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. Her first role with IPPNW was as a Quaker Voluntary Service Fellow. A strong believer in the power of grassroots movements, Molly works closely with IPPNW's global affiliate network and partners, including the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and Youth for TPNW, to build a groundswell of support for nuclear disarmament. She was on the founding steering committee of Youth for TPNW, currently represents IPPNW on ICAN's International Steering Group, and is a board member of the Nuclear Truth Project. Molly holds a Bachelor of Science in Social Work and Gender and Sexuality Studies from Salisbury University. Colleen Moore is a policy, advocacy, and campaign strategy professional and expert on nuclear disarmament, conflict transformation, peace building, and human rights and justice. She currently serves as the Director of Peace with Justice at the General Board of Church and Society, the social justice agency of the United Methodist Church. In her position, she is responsible for developing and managing the agency's legislative and policy advocacy in support of peace building, conflict resolution, nonproliferation and disarmament, and multilateralism. Prior to joining GBCS staff, Colleen served as advocacy director at Women Cross DMZ and also held roles at Global Zero, Beyond the Bomb, Win Without War, and Seeds of Peace. Welcome. We'll settle back into silence now, and I invite Molly and Colleen to break the silence when they feel led.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I think Molly is going to share her screen, and we can start our presentation. Thanks so much, everyone.
Can I get a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Great. Thank you all so much for being here this evening, or rather, thank you for having me here this evening. I'm really excited to be here and really excited to get back to some of my Quaker roots in the disarmament space. As Maddie outlined, I started as a Quaker voluntary service fellow coming on 6 years ago, and have a very strong spot in my heart for Pendle Hill, having attended a retreat there 6 years ago to the day almost. So really, really pleased to be here on this to commemorate the solemn anniversary of 80 years since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only two cities to be to suffer from an atomic bomb. Colleen and I are going to kind of popcorn style this presentation. You'll hear a bit about the work that each of us do. I'll share a testimony from a Hiroshima survivor. We'll learn a bit about the humanitarian impacts of the weapons. And then importantly, talk about what each of us can do going forward to rid ourselves of this existential threat to life. So please, thank you for being here today. Some of the information is obviously going to be quite heavy, but it is important for all of us to know the threat that we face. So I will again give a briefer on the humanitarian and health impacts of nuclear weapons, and then we'll go a bit into more detail on these other issue areas. So before I get into it, this is a quote from Setsuko Thurlow, who accepted the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She was just 13 years old when the United States struck Hiroshima with an atomic bomb. So I encourage you to maybe close your eyes or to look out into the distance and just hear what happened to her 80 years ago to the day almost. Setsuko says, "I was just 13 years old when the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on my city, Hiroshima. I still vividly remember that morning. At 8:15, I saw a blinding bluish white flash from the window. I remember having the sensation of floating in the air. As I regained consciousness in the silence and darkness, I found myself pinned by the collapsed building. I began to hear my classmates' faint cries, 'Mother, help me. God, help me.' Then suddenly I felt hands touching my left shoulder, and I heard a man saying, 'Don't give up. Keep pushing. I'm trying to free you. See the light coming through that opening? Crawl towards it as quickly as you can.'" Setsuko continues, "As I crawled out, the ruins were on fire. Most of my classmates in that building were burned to death alive. I saw all around me utter, unimaginable devastation. Processions of ghostly figures shuffled by. Grotesquely wounded people, they were bleeding, burnt, blackened, and swollen. Parts of their bodies were missing. Flesh and skin hung from their bones, some with their eyeballs hanging in their hands, some with their bellies burnt open, their intestines hanging out. the foul stench of burnt human flesh filled the air. Thus, with one bomb, my beloved city was obliterated. No, I share Setsuko's lived testimony, both because I think it's important to center ourselves in what these weapons really do to humans, and also because the Hibakusha are an aging population. There are fewer and fewer of them with us every year, and it's up to us to take their experiences forward and to warn the world about what these weapons really do to humans. They're not um, abstract toys that military personnel can play with. They're not abstract weapons that exist only in the minds of decision makers. They're pointed at cities, and they're a real, true, urgent threat. So to that end, a bit more on what happened 80 years ago in Hiroshima. 80 to 90% of nurses and physicians were killed or injured, and 42 out of 45 hospitals became non-functional. In Nagasaki, 74,000 people were killed immediately, with another 75,000 injured. And by the end of 1945, 200,000 civilian lives were lost. This is due to radiation exposure, lack of adequate medical care, and other complications. So again, for decades, Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just like Setsuko, have been sounding the alarm against these weapons, calling out their inhumane nature, and noting that they're different from other weapons. So that brings us to today. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are considered small or tactical nuclear weapons compared to today's standards. So if a single nuclear bomb were to be dropped on a major city today, we would have no infrastructure, which means no electricity, no water, no way to transport people from one place to another, and no way to communicate. Our phones would cease to work, and we'd have no way of reaching our loved ones. This includes health professionals, which I feel, obligated to share, working with a health organization. They'd be unable to help. Those who survive would lack the supplies and tools to treat complex injuries. This includes complex burns and other crush injuries. And it's, again, I think kind of special and important to note that modern hospitals really respond or really deeply depend on electricity and technology. You can't get into some rooms without an ID card or something like that. There's no way to use ultrasound materials, no way to check folks out, even if you are able to reach them. A report published by ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, about 3 years ago found that a 100 kiloton bomb, which is a pretty, for lack of a better word, standard size bomb in today's arsenals, detonated over Washington, D.C., would lead to 177,000 people immediately killed and another 383,000 injured. That means that one single doctor, and this is assuming again that the doctors are amongst the living and not incredibly injured themselves, would need to treat 26 severely injured people simultaneously. So there can be no medical response to these weapons. This is one single nuclear detonation. And today, 9 countries possess roughly over 2,000 warheads. So we just saw the impacts of one single bomb, and there are 12,000 warheads, which are operated, maintained by 9 nuclear armed states. So, we just went through what would happen with one bomb. Using less than 3% of the world's nuclear weapons, a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which this is just a scenario, 2 nuclear weapon states that are often in conflict with one another, could kill up to every 3rd person on Earth due to soot and debris blocking out the sun, dropping global temperatures, and leading to the collapse of crop production. This would lead to an average global temperature drop of 1.3 degrees Celsius, and a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and Russia would kill an estimated 5 billion people worldwide within 2 years because of that same cycle of temperatures dropping, sunlight being blocked. This I'm not the first to say it, and I know I'm amongst good company here at Pendle Hill, but this is the true definition of madness. There can be no real reason to continue the existence of these weapons. They're incompatible with life. We saw it 80 years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that should have been the end of the nuclear age. And regrettably, that was just the beginning. For 80 years now, we've lived under this sword of Damocles. So I want to finish here before passing it off to Colleen, who will frame some of this from a faith perspective. And then again, we'll talk a bit about what we can do, which is really all we can do when we're faced with these humanitarian impacts, right, is to think of how we move forward. I want to close with Setsuko's remarks from that same speech that I started with, which I think kind of pulls all of this together in the way that she so specially does. So she says, "To me, Elijah, who is her 4-year-old nephew who died in the days following the bombing of Hiroshima, came to represent all the innocent children of the world, threatened as they are at this very moment by nuclear weapons. Every second of every day, nuclear weapons endanger everyone we love and everything we hold dear. We must not tolerate this insanity any longer." And we won't. So I'll pass it to Colleen now, and we'll hear a bit more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Molly. And first of all, thank you to Maddie and to Pendle Hill for inviting us today to be a part of this. And thank you everyone for being here. I just want to start off by, maybe we can take another deep cleansing breath. I know that what we're talking about is so heavy, as Molly pointed out at the beginning. So maybe just taking a second just to come back to our breath and really processing what we're hearing about today. I know it's extremely heavy what Molly just shared. So, as Molly said, a lot of what I'll be talking about is theological grounding for this work of nuclear abolition. Of course, I work for the United Methodist Church, so I can mostly speak to our work, but I grew up Catholic. I've attended a variety of churches and have been a part of different faith traditions, including Quakers. So I will try to keep this as applicable as possible to all of you, and just overall how faith plays such a strong role in this movement. So faith communities do have such a strong theological and moral grounding to be advocating for social justice, including abolishing nuclear weapons. So you'll see on the screen some biblical scripture that provides a theological grounding for this work. And I just want to point out a few key passages. So pointing out Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes, which is a series of blessings spoken by Jesus during the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And also Micah 4:3, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. So, as people of faith, we must strive to achieve Micah's vision of not only a disarmed world, but also a transformed culture. Because iron plows and pruning tools can be used as weapons, but in Micah's vision, these weapons of violence are transformed into tools for genuine peace and security. And it's because of this culture shift. It's not just because of the disarmament itself, it's because of both. So, if we go to the next slide. As people of faith, we are called to build what is called peace with justice, which is reflecting the shalom of the Bible. So in the Bible, shalom is the Hebrew word that signifies a state of wholeness, completeness, well-being, and peace. And it's not just the absence of conflict, but it's also the presence of harmony, prosperity, and right relationships with God and others. And as we're talking about conflict resolution, a lot of you may be familiar with the term positive peace to reflect not just the absence of violence, but also abundance in society to live full lives. So if we are to live into our mission of transforming the world, We have to prioritize collaboration amongst nations, work to reduce the use and need for weapons, and foster just, equitable, and durable solutions to the root causes of conflict. And so the Christian community, including the United Methodists, the Quakers, the Catholics, and beyond, have been long active in this movement to abolish nuclear weapons. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what we do at the United Methodist Church. So the UMC has long called for nuclear abolition since the 1980s, one of the first denominations to do so. And what makes the United Methodist Church unique in our social justice work is we have the social principles, and this is a document that stands in the Wesleyan tradition of forthright moral witness and ethical action. The social principles were first adopted in 1972, and they were rewritten and adopted at last year's General Conference in 2024, which is our legislative body. And the 2025 to 2028 social principles addresses global social concerns reflecting the diverse context of the worldwide church, and they specifically call for nuclear abolition. It states that we grieve that in a world where so many live in poverty, governments continue to dedicate enormous resources to preparing for and conducting wars. We are especially distressed by the proliferation of nuclear weapons and call not only for an end to their production, but for their complete elimination. And if you're interested in reading the social principles, I think Maddie can drop it in the chat as well. And our social principles are backed by resolutions on a number of topics. We have a resolution called the United Methodist Church in Peace that states if there is any concern in the international community where international law intersects with ethics and morality, it is the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And we can put that in the chat as well. The Council of Bishops of the Church released a study document in 1986 as an urgent message to all United Methodists and the Church at large on the growing threat of nuclear war and of the extinction of life on the planet through a nuclear winter. And the bishops reasserted that the nuclear crisis threatens planet Earth itself, that the arms race destroys millions of lives in conventional wars, repressive violence, and massive poverty, and that the arms race is a social justice issue, not only a war and peace issue. So we can go to the next slide. And while I'm not a Quaker, I have worked alongside many faith traditions for years on nuclear abolition, and Quakers have always been at the forefront of this movement. And that's really because, their affirmation of pacifism and the belief that we must seek the light within each and the holy oneness of all humanity that defeats and disarms all justifications for warfare. And there's so many amazing organizations that do this work. Just to point out a few, the American Friends Service Committee and the Friends Committee on National Legislation are based in DC and do so much congressional work and other advocacy work, and encourage you, I'm sure that all of you are familiar in some way with them, but encourage you to check out their websites and see what they're doing on nuclear abolition. And we'll talk a little bit later about the congressional work, as well as the Quaker UN office. They are present at the UN as well. So next slide. And so really to sum up, the involvement of faith communities in this work is so important. Our spiritual traditions inform our perspectives. While humanity is capable of inflicting apocalyptic harm, humanity is also capable of collaborating in solidarity for life and well-being. It's a moral and it's a humanitarian imperative to eliminate nuclear weapons. The unchecked presence of nuclear weapons threatens life itself, which contradicts the commandment to love our neighbors and to seek justice. And faith communities provide a certain institutional backing and this moral and theological imperative that is really important when we're communicating to lawmakers and to the public. And when I'm talking to congressional offices or talking to a group, it's not just me calling more as an individual, calling on them to do this. And while, those in powers absolutely do need to listen to individuals, they need to listen to their constituents and impacted communities, it does bring a certain power to be backed like an institution like the UMC. I can say, again, this isn't just me. I know that this is wrong, but this is, for the last 40 years, extremely large and powerful institution like the UMC has called to abolish these weapons. And especially those lawmakers who at least claim to be Christian, we need to call on them to truly reflect Jesus's call to be peacemakers. Especially in this time, we're seeing that our lawmakers are not prioritizing grace over greed. They are not putting the needs of our communities over politics and over corporate greed. And we have a campaign at my agency with the UMC called Grace Over Greed, where United Methodists call on their lawmakers as followers of Christ to prioritize the action of grace over the selfish abuse of greed. And we were very active during the budget reconciliation process, where the defense budget ended up being more than $1 trillion in this past fiscal year, while we're cutting Medicaid and we're cutting SNAP funding. And we continue to be active during this appropriations process for this next fiscal year. And so it's just so important. And I think it has shown that lawmakers do listen to especially Christian communities. And I'll end this section with, Christians have had especially a history of inflicting harm on so many communities around the world. And this theology is many times used to justify oppression and injustice. And that's not the faith that we're a part of, right? I mean, the faith that I follow emphasizes peace with justice. And I do truly believe that it is our duty as Christians to work to achieve Micah's vision of a peaceful, just, disarmed world. And we must call on our lawmakers to actually heed Jesus's call to be peacemakers. So with that, I think we're going to get into talking a little bit more about how to take action. So I'll turn it back to you, Molly.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Colleen. That was a really incredible and great overview, and I think kind of, framed what we're going to do next. Now we know what the problem is. We know why it relates to the foundation that you all come from, and that many of you come from, rather. I'll talk a bit about taking action internationally, the work that I get to do with IPPNW's global network and our partners. And then Colleen's going to take it and give an overview of work that's being done within the US. And obviously, both of these things feed into one another, are mutually reinforcing, and build upon the work of each other. So a lot of my work is around promoting the ban treaty. The Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, or the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, is built on decades of advocacy. I'm sure advocacy that some of you have engaged in the past, from both the Freeze movement, from advocacy from the Hibakusha, from the survivors of nuclear weapons testing, building upon norms that were set through the IMF, from New START, from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and calling for the complete and total abolition of these weapons, recognizing that this step-by-step process on the international stage has not worked, and that it has not heeded enough action from the nuclear armed states that have been at a continued standstill amongst themselves, continuing to invest billions of dollars in their arsenals, continuing to wage opaque and translucent threats to use their weapons. With all of this in mind, members of the global community, from civil society and from states, primarily states from the global south, came together and said, no more, we need a comprehensive ban, and thus was born the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As you can see from this graphic here, it has the support from the majority of UN member states. It was voted into the UN General Assembly with 122 countries voting in favor. And there's just this small but mighty group that continues to boycott and work against this comprehensive ban of the weapons, which is obviously the 9 nuclear armed states and their allies. But I bring up this ban both because it shifts the narrative on, who is a decision maker in this work, in this field. It's not just the 9 nuclear armed states, it's the world, because as I spoke about earlier, the impacts of these weapons are global, and also shifts the narrative of one of stale militaristic doctrine to one that centers the humanitarian impacts of these weapons, which is a really incredible feat for anybody that's been in this space for a while. It's something that I know we've continued to work for decades and decades and decades, to bring this human-centered approach. This was done with both the Hibakusha testimony, the survivors of the nuclear age, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and this new scientific data of nuclear famine and nuclear winter. So this ban treaty categorically prohibits the development, testing, production, acquisition, possession, stockpiling, use, threat of use, and transfer of nuclear weapons. So again, it is a comprehensive ban of these weapons, and at this stage is primarily a stigmatization tool, but also has a few provisions that are actively being worked on amongst the member states of this treaty. So what does that mean for us here today? What does it mean to take action internationally? There's that UN saying of thinking global and acting local, which I think at this point is maybe a bit of a cliche, but I think is incredibly important, right? For us to take inspiration from the global stage, bring it down to our local level, whether we're looking at spending priorities, as Colleen said, the arms race is an ongoing issue. It's definitely not something of the past, and that impacts local politics. It impacts state politics. It impacts all of the work that each of us do towards providing or creating rather a sane and sustainable planet and country for all of us. That can be done through city actions. So we have ICANN cities appeals, where cities agree that they are a nuclear-free city and that they endorse the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That is all around the world. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cities that have joined on to the cities appeal. In the US, it looks like Back from the Brink and that campaign platform, which Colleen's going to talk about in a bit more detail. There are also parliamentary pledges where Congress people, mayors, senators, and other decision makers are encouraged to sign on to a pledge that they support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that they support the end of the nuclear age, and encourages them to take action then on a local level to encourage education and this awareness building. There are divestment campaigns that folks can join in on. Obviously, you might think of banks immediately, but also looking at other institutions like universities and other places of work. And really, I think the biggest thing that each of us can do, which might seem so small, but I think is so important, is general awareness raising and promoting disarmament education and sharing the stories of those that are most affected by these weapons. I come from a generation that does not know, or did not grow up rather, in the ills of the Cold War. And I was shocked to my core when I came to IPPNW and learned about the continued existence of nuclear weapons and the threat that they pose to all of us. And we're truly doing current and future generations a disservice by deciding to not share this horrifying information with them. But by sharing this information, we're allowing people to have the agency to take action and not just sit in fear when you see headlines on your screen or when you might come across the danger that we all face. So those are a few actions that folks can take. Also encouraging people to come to the UN for these annual meetings for the TPNW. Colleen had a photo up earlier of a whole group of people outside of a church in New York City that was on the margins of a TPNW meeting just earlier this year. I think it's really important for us to kind of demystify the UN. The UN is a space for all of us as global citizens. We have a right to be there, a right to share our thoughts and ideas, and a right to push our government to take action, which I think right now feels like we're, I don't know, slow moving, I would say. But incredibly important to show up and to show that Americans care about this issue and that we're not willing to give up. So I'm happy to share more information on that. The next TPNW or ban treaty meeting at the UN is next November. So all are welcome to join, see what's going on there and to take action. So Colleen's going to give a bit more grounding on what folks are doing in the US.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. I think that dovetails really well with how to get more involved locally and talking about what's going on in Congress as well. So when thinking about how to get involved, I like to divide it up into three categories: pray, learn, and reflect, and then act. So if you go to the next slide, I'll kind of divide out these categories on how to get involved. So with praying, I mean, we've been talking about this theological grounding, and as Christians, personal but also communal transformation is so pivotal. So you can hold vigils and draw strength from each one's deepest convictions and longings for a better future, or hold other events in your area, and you can incorporate themes of peace building into sermons and prayers using that theological underpinnings that I talked about earlier. And we're doing a lot of that this week. August 6th also marks Nuclear Prayer Day to commemorate the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there's a nuclear prayer that they use during their events. And I know we can follow up with those resources after, but I know there's a lot going on later this week and even starting today and tomorrow of a variety of events you can probably get involved in your area. And the second part is learn and reflect. And it's really about deepening the engagement in your congregations and your communities. And it's important to study together. And I recommend book studies on books like Hiroshima by John Hersey, or holding Bible studies on Micah and really talking through as a congregation what you can do to get more involved, and holding dialogue with each other and with other faith traditions. That interfaith dialogue is really important. And then finally, ACT. So the United Methodist Church is a steering committee member of Back from the Brink, which is a US-based grassroots coalition of individuals, organizations, and elected officials working together to rid the world of nuclear weapons and secure a set of common sense US nuclear weapons policy that will make the world safer, healthier, and more just. And you can learn more about joining a hub in your area to organize and to advocate, and Maddie can drop that link in the chat. And part of what we do is advocate for that legislation. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about Congress. So that's one of the most important things you can do right now, is to advocate to your federal representatives and senators to take legislative action to eliminate nuclear weapons. So there is a resolution that was recently reintroduced in the House, and for the first time introduced in the Senate as well. We have a Senate companion calling on the U.S. to lead the world back from the brink of nuclear war and halt and reverse the nuclear arms race. So the resolution calls for nuclear risk reduction steps like implementing a nuclear no first use policy. So the U.S. would renounce the option of using nuclear weapons first, and implementing checks and balances on the commander-in-chief's sole authority to order the use of nuclear weapons, as well as ending hair trigger alert posture, ending plans to produce and deploy new nuclear warheads and delivery systems, maintaining the global moratorium on nuclear explosive testing, protecting communities and workers affected by nuclear weapons, and actively planning a just economic transition for the civilian and military workforce and communities involved in the nuclear weapons industry. And it does mention the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as well, and advocates for the US to sign that. It's not necessarily a centerpiece for it, but I think what's really unique about this resolution is it outlines these pretty common sense set of policies, but it is also couched in this larger moral imperative to definitively abolish these weapons. I will say it's an extremely tough environment in DC, and any legislation on nuclear abolition, or even like I was talking about, some of these, more common sense policies, will be extremely hard to pass or get a majority of Congress to support, considering the Republican trifecta and, even lack of support from many Democrats. But it's still extremely important to deepen lawmakers' commitment right now to not only pursue risk reduction and disarmament steps, but also work toward abolition. And our aim really is to show growing political support year after year, which we have. I mean, this is only a few months in, and we already have, I think, around 30 co-sponsors on the House resolution. And so, we're continuing to add, especially Democrats, every day. And I think it is, a really important step that we have a Senate version as well for the first time. And really it is that we cannot let our lawmakers off the hook, even when the goals are lofty. We can't just, sit back and say, oh, what do you want us to do about this? There is something we can do. We can continue talking about it. And like I said, when talking to lawmakers, it's so important to use this moral and theological grounding. And I know Molly mentioned a little bit about getting involved in city resolutions and on more of a local level. And so while, federal legislation is important, there's also so many ways to get involved locally, like passing a municipal resolution in your city or your town on nuclear abolition. And we have seen that that tends to put pressure on federal representatives and senators to then take action. We have seen, direct impacts of passing those local and city resolutions. And yeah, I think this is just really important to, see at all levels. Molly covered that, the international and kind of getting it down to, from global to local. And it's so important to be involved at all levels. So I will pass it back to you, Molly, to talk a little bit more about working with frontline communities.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is so important to show that that groundswell of support exists, and it does. All of these levels feed into one another on both ends. I know, again, for a fact that I know of countries that would not have joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons if it hadn't been for normal campaigners taking action and encouraging their foreign ministries to act, which is very similar to writing to a member of Congress. It's just to another level. So it's really neat and really important to show that continued effort and continued work. And just one final thing, I think, on Back from the Brink is any naysayers that say that these resolutions aren't important and that they're just words. At the very least, it's an educational tool. At the very least, you're showing people that this threat still exists. At the very least, you're giving people an action to take. And I don't really think that can be overstated at a point where I think everything truly is and feels quite dire and like things are out of our control. So it's very important to have that platform. So with that, this is the final piece to our presentation before we go into a Q&A, where we'll talk a bit about the importance of working with frontline communities, looking at both the global impacts of the nuclear age, so beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the impact of the 2,000 plus nuclear weapons tests that happened throughout the world, including on our own land here in the United States, where Colleen will talk a bit about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and the importance of centering, again, these lived experiences. I think that this piece of the puzzle as it is just strengthens the work and shows the importance of building the stigmatization against these weapons and continuing to push against any future harms that they may bring to peoples and the environment, because it truly is pretty all-consuming when we look at it. So with that, again, there were over 2,000 nuclear weapons tests conducted globally by the United States, Soviet Union, Russia, obviously, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. These were all done on either colonized or indigenous lands, looking at Kazakhstan, French Polynesia, also known as Maui Nui, the Marshall Islands, Australia, Algeria, and beyond, where people still live with the long-term health and environmental damage of these so-called tests, or I think we should probably call them what they are, as nuclear weapons detonations that happened in the air, in the soil, in the land, in the water of peoples who are already, for the most part, marginalized. But as we know, radiation knows no bounds. So even though these weapons were conducted, or these detonations were conducted on indigenous and colonized lands, their impacts have truly been felt in every corner of the world. Tests that were done in the Marshall Islands by the United States, their impacts were seen in both in the Marshall Islands, way, way, way out in the Pacific, were seen in both Mexico City and India from one single test, Castle Bravo. So that really shows the impact of what these tests did throughout the 20th century. Their impacts are intergenerational. So even though the lived experience of people that maybe felt them firsthand is waning, the experience of second and third generation survivors is still being felt today. And those people continue to show up and to say, hey, my community was harmed by this test. Hey, my community had to migrate outside of outside of our homes because of the impacts of these tests. Hey, I have cancer, my cousin has cancer, you know, outlining the lived experience and the impacts of these tests. So these detonations were made illegal under the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty decades ago, which the US has not yet ratified. But even with that win as it is, we still need to continue to build stigmatization. Under Project 2025, there is the promise, I will say it is, or the intention to continue nuclear weapons tests. And we need to continue to say that that is not a harmless task, and that's something that actually has, again, intergenerational impacts. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons includes obligations for victim assistance and environmental remediation under 2 articles of the treaty, and there is ongoing work within the treaty's body to look at what that can look like. You know, with the 9 nuclear armed states not party to this treaty, it's a bit uncertain as to, you know, where that assistance and remediation will come from, who will fund that work. But right now it's coming from TPNW states parties themselves that are saying it's been too long. People have not received any medical compensation. They have not received any compensation for the ongoing harms that these tests have made. So I'll conclude before passing it on to Colleen here that survivors and affected communities are and need to continue to be central to advocacy, negotiations, and treaty implementations. We need to stand in global solidarity with survivors of these tests. Again, some of which are people in the US. You know, we bombed ourselves in the Southwest. Others are just people that have the right to self-determination, and the United States and other nuclear armed states took that away from them. So Colleen will talk a bit about some wins that we've seen in the US through RICA, and other reasons why it's important to bring them in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Molly. So talking about RICA, which is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, this provides financial compensation to individuals who have contracted certain cancers or other diseases due to exposure to radiation from nuclear weapons tests or uranium mining activities. So the law expired in 2024 last year, and it unfortunately left many victims without compensation. But fortunately, the fiscal year 2025 budget reconciliation bill that passed in July reauthorized RICA and expanded the eligibility criteria to areas like Utah. And this has been a big bipartisan effort, I think, compared to some other efforts that we've seen on nuclear abolition. I mean, Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri was a pivotal leader in moving this forward alongside so many other leaders in Congress. But I will say that many communities impacted by the nuclear weapons industrial complex continue to be excluded from this legislation. So while this is, of course, a huge win, I mean, if this wasn't reauthorized, we would have seen so many people without this compensation, but it's still not comprehensive enough. Unfortunately, they did kind of have to cut a deal in order to get this in the budget this year. So the work continues, but it is such a huge win that we've seen in the last few years. If we go to the next slide, I'll just conclude by, saying that this work on nuclear justice is so important and we wanted to talk about it because any organizing for justice has to be done in conjunction with and taking leadership from impacted communities. And organizing with frontline communities is inherently a gospel practice. Jesus invited, trained, and equipped disciples and sent them into communities to preach the gospel. And so organizing grows the reign of God on earth by fostering deep, intentional, and incarnational relationships in our churches and communities. And this work is what leads to teams, networks, and movements working together for justice. So I would encourage you on any issue that you're working on, including nuclear abolition, we have to ask ourselves, who is directly impacted by this issue? What are their goals in their work, in their organizing work? And how can we learn from the relationships that we have with people who are directly impacted by this issue? And, just thinking back to the beginning of this presentation when Molly was talking about these lived testimonies, how can we really be getting those testimonies out to people, especially as Molly said, that the population is unfortunately aging, and it really is on us to get these stories out there and really taking leadership from them of what is it that you are working towards and how can we be of help in getting that out there and working for abolition and working for justice. So with that, I think we will conclude our presentation. I hope this was helpful to hear about lived testimonies, faith grounding, and taking action, and finally why we have to ground this advocacy in the experience of frontline communities. So I think we'll be getting into the Q&A session, so I'll pass it back to Maddie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Colleen and Molly, for that wonderful and sobering presentation. This is difficult to think about, difficult to hear the stories and know that unfortunately things are still really bad. It's been 80 years and yet the work continues. So I can speak, I think, on behalf of probably everyone here to say thank you for the work that you're doing. And would love to continue the conversation with this question and answer portion. So thank you to those who have already put in a question. We still have plenty of time. So if you have a question, please add it to the question and answer, and I will try to get to as many as we can. And I can start off with a comment. So if you have a comment, we might be able to read that as well, which there's a person who I think is still here um, who says, "Thank you very much for your lecture. I am originally from Kazakhstan. My name is Marat. I just want to say that this is a very serious issue. People still suffering, not only in Kazakhstan, where 450 tests were conducted." And this person says, as a co-founder of Nuclear Free World Foundation, I and my partners are trying to work on this issue. So thank you for being here. And I see some other familiar faces from other nuclear weapons advocacy groups as well. One kind of policy related question for either of you. Stan from Baltimore says, our president seems quite irrational at times. So of the 5 action items in Back from the Brink, it seems that having a safeguard against that one person being able to start a nuclear war is most important. Does that make sense, or is it best to keep all 5 together? The 5 points within Back from the Brink.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. Thank you, Stan, for that question. It's a really great point. So I do believe, yeah, that no first use and ending sole authority is extremely important in this time. I think one thing I always try to emphasize is that, it doesn't matter who the president is. No matter what, they should not have sole authority to launch a nuclear strike. So I think you're right that, the no first use and the ending sole authority aspect of the Back from the Brink platform is extremely important because it obviously is very pertinent with Trump right now. And I think in my past work at Beyond the Bomb and Global Zero, that was really the first step that we had outlined on our, multi-year campaign of elimination of nuclear weapons is starting with ending sole authority through no first use, because I do think it has impact in the community, again, especially back in the first Trump administration, and especially back in his first term, and especially right now as well. So I do think, heavily emphasizing that is important. But I do think it's important to have this set of policies together, because honestly, like, we do need to throw as much at the wall as possible. I mean, I think we would welcome, progress from the Trump administration on, like, I know in another question that we'll get to about renewing the New START treaty, we do need to resume nuclear diplomacy with Russia and with other nuclear armed countries. We do need to talk about, a just transition and other nuclear justice issues like what we talked about with RICA. We do need, ending hair trigger alert and sole authority and a sole authority and nuclear no first use. So that is kind of why we have included those policies together. because it isn't just about any one risk reduction measure. It is just about this larger campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And we have seen actually more reception from congressional offices when it is this kind of package of policies. We have there is another bill, I think it's from Senator Markey and Representative Liu on ending sole authority. And I don't know how much they're pushing that right now, but what we've seen as the priority is more of the ones that I was talking about, the back from the brink resolutions. But yeah, I do think the no first use and ending sole authority is still extremely important to focus on. And yeah, I don't know if Molly, you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add from a campaigning side is the policy platform gives people a vision, instead of just ending sole authority, which doesn't obviously deal with the crux of the problem, right? The problem is the weapons themselves, as Colleen said, not who is in charge. You know, when Biden was president, I didn't feel, well, I guess I do feel significantly less safe right now than I did a year ago, but did not feel safe, and none of us should feel safe while these weapons are in anybody's hand. And I think by having this five-step solution, or five-point policy platform, it allows campaigners and organizers to say, here's the problem, here's what we can do about it, and having a long-term vision. And I think you're right, Colleen, completely that the no first use issue does bring people in, and then it brings people into a larger conversation, right? It's not just, okay, we did this, now we're done, good job. It connects it to a much broader campaigning effort.
Great, thank you all so much. I'll say there's a kind of quick question about your last answer and then another one. So one question is the resolution you mentioned, are they bipartisan? And then also you kind of started with it, Colleen, but I would love to hear your thoughts more on James asks about New Start and whether it should be, or James is saying it should be a priority in the next 6 months to replace New Start. So I would love to hear your thoughts, share a little bit maybe for folks who are less familiar. So yeah, how the bipartisan nature, and if you could talk a little bit about the New Start Treaty.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the resolutions that I mentioned are not bipartisan. There are only Democrats on right now. I do see some inroads maybe with certain Republican lawmakers, and we are having those meetings and trying to make the case for some key Republicans to co-sponsor. Probably the House resolution is more apt to get Republicans. I'm not convinced that it will happen, though, unfortunately. I mean, I think this is a very bold resolution, and I think it is really amazing that we have 30, even if it's just Democrats on this resolution. I'm not sure that, especially all of these policies, how many Republicans would, yeah, be in support of this, unfortunately, but it is a priority of ours to try to get more bipartisan support because I do think in this time we need some kind of bipartisan support. And like I mentioned earlier with Rika, we do know that nuclear justice is it's a bipartisan issue. I mean, the ones that have been really pushing on it are some of the Republicans, and I think it is because they heard so much from their constituents. Like in Missouri, the Missouri constituents were very, very vocal, and that's really what brought Senator Hawley in. Utah, New Mexico, there were so many constituencies that were very vocal about their lawmakers getting involved. So I do think it shows also the impacts of why we need to do organizing as well, and start from this local organizing all the way up to the national, international level. We see that it works. So I think even though I'm skeptical about getting Republicans on, I think we do need to try because we have seen success with that before. And so talking about New Start, and I'd also love to hear Molly's thoughts on this. Yeah, I think that's a huge priority in the next 6 months. I know that a lot of organizations are actually doing like a countdown between the August 6th and 9th anniversaries to when New Start expires in early February. So for everyone that's here, if you might not be familiar with New Start, it's essentially the last standing treaty between the US and Russia that has checks on the nuclear arsenals of the U.S. and Russia, the two countries with the biggest nuclear arsenals, Russia and then the U.S. So it's the last remaining treaty, and it is set to expire in early February. Biden renewed it when he first came in 4 years ago, and it's up for expiration early next year. And so there is a resolution, one in the House and one in the Senate, from Senator Markey and Representative Foster, HRES 100 and SRES 61, that does specifically address the replacement of New START. And I know that maybe we could put the link to FCNL's action alert in there. I know we have an action alert at UMC for this, as well as the Back from the Brink resolutions. And I also think, when we're advocating for the resolutions that I was talking about, the ones on Back from the Brink, it does emphasize nuclear diplomacy and the importance of renewing and extending New START and just follow-on negotiations. I think that New START has been so tenuous that there do need to be further conversations of extending New START is the first step. But what does the nuclear arms control infrastructure look going forward? Because we've lost so many. I mean, we withdrew from Open Skies, we withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty under the first Trump administration. Like it's the infrastructure is really being eroded, and it's clear that we need further dialogue. And of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made that really difficult to get back to the table. But that is going to be, it is a priority of the disarmament community right now to extend that. So yeah, Molly, I'm curious what you have to add too.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add. I think that you're just right, Colleen. And I think, the importance of renewing and extending New START is incredibly important, but we need more than these short-term band-aid solutions, right? I mean, we saw earlier this year that the Trump administration seems to think that bombing nuclear facilities is a non-proliferation strategy. Who's to say that that won't build out more with other countries? And I think we can all agree on this call that the use of force is not a non-proliferation or diplomatic strategy, and the need for trust, open dialogue, and diplomacy is incredibly important. It can be hard to see a world where that's sorted out in the next 6 months, if I'm being completely honest right now. It's a really scary place that we're in, and Trump makes a lot of promises and a lot of threats, many of which he doesn't follow through with. And in the past few weeks has been very hot and cold on Putin and engaging with Putin. So it is a priority for the disarmament and arms control community. And yeah, really encourage folks to look at that FCNL link and take action and encourage your representatives. And I think it's also important to recognize that none of these actions are either or. We can call for and acknowledge that the elimination of nuclear weapons is the goal, and also recognize that these interim steps, whether it be the continuation of New START, a return to some form of diplomacy with Iran, no first use, and to sole authority, all of these things are steps that are really, really important for safeguarding our future and for just taking real, true common sense steps forward. But there is time. We're not too late to renew and extend New START. So really, yeah, encourage folks to take action now. And I think that we're going to have quite the reckoning in the next few months in the community to, try to push something forward. And to not accept any excuses that China has to be on board, or that all of these other kind of throwing things at the wall, as both Putin and Trump have been doing, are adequate, because they're not.
Thank you. Francis, would you like to ask the question from the barn at Pendle Hill?
Yeah, I wanted to first thank you so much. It's been really, really meaningful to be with all of you. This hybrid format provides some challenges, but especially facing something of this magnitude, knowing that we can come together in person and also connect across distance feels really grounding and really hopeful that we can keep learning together and keep connecting both kind of in person and with folks all around the world. So thank you for being here. There's a few other questions that were shared with us. One is exploring other strategies. Friends, the Quakers have a very strong history of war tax resistance, not paying for war preparations. Wonder if either of you have any thoughts or experience with war tax resistance as part of the struggle against nuclear weapons.
I don't know, but I think right now is a moment where we need to take action and see what works, encouraging creativity and bold action and learning from what's worked in the past and trying it again. We're in a really, really similar situation that we were in 40 years ago, with an immense arms buildup and immense danger. And yeah, I think acting like we're in a moment of crisis, acting like we're in the moment of crisis that we're in, requires actions like that. And I think another piece to maybe bring into this discussion, which hasn't been mentioned yet, but are that these weapons manufacturers that are building nuclear weapons are the same that are destroying Gaza and that are wreaking havoc around the world. So if there's a time to take action against these weapons manufacturers and encourage action at weapons sites, as I know Quakers often do in the Boston area. I know that they do around here, at Raytheon sites and other places. Now's the time to do so.
That was actually
Yeah.
the second. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna add that I also don't necessarily have experience with like the not paying the war tax, but I do think, as Molly said, it's really important. I think especially around the conversations with the budget right now. I mean, I think the public was very invested in resisting the Medicaid and the SNAP cuts and so many things that we saw with the budget reconciliation bill that passed back in July. And I know that I think it's National Priorities Project has a really great tool where you can see, the direct impacts of these cuts. I don't know if they have it yet updated for that budget, but you can put in for the nuclear weapons budget or for the defense budget, how many nurses could that afford? How many kids could we send to school? How many people could we have with healthcare? And so I think it is really important to talk about that right now, because I saw that, especially during that process, it was really hard to kind of organize people around other issues besides that, because it was so impactful on their local communities. I mean, they were worried, will I and my neighbors have health care after this budget passes? What about the SNAP cuts or the hospital cuts in my area? And we did see more momentum around it when we did really make these intersectional connections of how our budgets are moral documents and how it's clearly not reflecting the needs of our communities. So and I'll just add to what Molly said of divestment is so key right now. And I'm not working on a lot on nuclear weapons specifically, but I am doing a little bit around Gaza right now. And I do think, we are seeing a lot of movement around there. I mean, there are certain bonds that the United Methodist Church voted last year to divest from. That was Israeli government bonds specifically. But I do think we are seeing certain investment funds and just the public. I think there's more attention on this. So how can we, move that conversation forward a little bit more in this time?
Thank you so much. I think in the follow-up resources, we can also include some resources on war tax resistance. And also another kind of invitation to action from the room. You mentioned the demonstrations at military and weapons sites, and there is an annual demonstration at the local Lockheed Martin and King of Prussia here, where friends carry a copy of the UN Nuclear Abolition Treaty every August 6th at noon. So there's a friend here. You can find out more if you're local. And I appreciate also you lifting up all these varied ways of engaging in this issue. A very specific question before I turn it back online. There was a reference to the TPNW. I think, can you remind us what that is and a little more context about it?
Yeah, sorry. We use so many acronyms and I try so hard to not be the person that just throws them out there, but I always end up doing it. The TPNW is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, often referred to as the Nuclear Ban Treaty. So it's the treaty I spoke a bit about that has support from the majority of world's nations, continues to be boycotted by the 9 nuclear armed states, but is international law, having entered into force through the UN in 2021, and continues to grow support and continues to work towards all of the issues that we've spoken on today.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you folks in the barn there at Pendle Hill. We have a little bit more time for questions, and so keep them coming if you have them. The next one is potentially outside of the scope of this conversation in some ways, but is related, and for those of us here in Pennsylvania is local. So I will ask it and see if either of you have any thoughts on it. Marcia says they are currently taking public comments on the restarting of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. Can you steer folks to helpful, impactful points the public can share? Also, I have yet to hear any safe and lasting way that nuclear waste materials can be stored. Are there some articles you can share, perhaps in your follow-up email, that speak to this?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, which is going to be a non-answer, Marcia. I'm sorry, because it's also not my area of expertise. I really focus on the weapons, but IPPNW and I personally fully recognize the connection between the nuclear power industry and the nuclear weapons industry, and the fuel cycles being the same, and the impacts of meltdowns and nuclear weapons detonations being very similar in the lasting damage of radiation. And you're right, I have the same understanding that there's no safe and lasting way to secure and store nuclear waste materials. And glad to hear that they are taking public comments. I think what we can do, I know that there are some legacy IPPNW reports from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s on 3 Mile Island and other nuclear power meltdowns, which I would be more than happy to share with Maddie, who can then maybe share it over email. But yeah, wish I had more to share.
Yeah, I also don't have too much to share because this is not my area of expertise, but I know that the United Methodist Church has expressed concern about nuclear waste because of the environmental and health impacts. So I think that, and I'm looking back to a resolution, I don't think we renewed it at our general conference last year, but it was on the books in 2016. So I think we might renew it in a few years. But I know the recommendations really revolve around reviewing the safety of plants and instituting improvement programs, researching new designs for plant safety. So if I mean, I think focusing really on the impacts of the 3 Mile Island incident is really important. But I mean, if you feel like it is going to move forward, I do wonder if there's like certain like feasibility studies, like environmental impact studies, that we can like force them to do before it reopens of really promising the public that it is safe, because it doesn't seem maybe that they have done that at this point. I can't say that they have or haven't, but I would really encourage, yeah, just to have some of those recommendations and comments, probably couched in a larger ask to not reopen. But yeah, I can also see what resolutions we've had and see if we can include that in follow up as well. And yeah, sorry, I'm not more hopeful as well.
Thank you both. And I also added in the chat a group that I worked with a little bit in my last role was the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. So they may have some resources on that website I put in the chat. So perhaps depending on the length of your answer, this could be a final question. We could kind of take our time with it. Some questions that we received prior when people were registering for this program were around this theme of how do we recreate or get back to, or in a different way, build upon the important work that was happening in the 1980s. I know you both mentioned it, and I'm sure many folks on this call were around and maybe, you know, we're in New York City in 1982, right, at the big march, or, you know, we're doing advocacy in their own way. So if you were, thank you. And I think there was this real feeling then, from what I hear, that you know, there was a sense of hope and progress and accomplishment amidst the terror and everything else. And so I think there's this question of how to what would that look like in today's day and age? You know, there are so many issues. We're all concerned with so many things, and I can speak for myself. When my job was organizing on nuclear weapons, it was really difficult to um, encourage people to take action given everything they have going on in their lives. And sometimes this feeling of removal, although I think it's clear in your remarks and for many of us that these weapons impact us very directly. So I would love to just hear any thoughts that you all have about this feeling, this, you know, movement building, this moment that we're in. I know you've been mentioning it throughout your remarks, but if you have any more thoughts, and if perhaps your journey into this work, if that is part of the answer, I will say, you know, in the scheme of things, I think all three of us are young-ish, right? So I think I find it really powerful when, is particularly as well with youth for TPNW and other even younger folks than us are involved in this issue. So curious on your thoughts of, yeah, how the movement might continue to grow, and what lessons we maybe learned from the 1980s and beyond, and invite personal reflections if that was like part of your answer as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off. And yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's so important to both honor the legacy of activists who were so pivotal in the nuclear freeze movement and the success that they did have, and also continue to think of new creative avenues. And I think that's, you know, in the Back from the Brink resolutions that we work on, I think that really was an inspiration. It's like halt and reverse, you know, freeze the nuclear arms race, because that's what's most important right now, is freeze where we're at and then work to reverse it and work towards certain disarmament initiatives. But I do think that is a huge source of inspiration, especially the success they had with the public. And I think that was because of, you know, so much with a culture shift. And I think we saw the impact of media. I mean, there was the movie The Day After that I think had such a huge impact on the public back then. And I think we can, you know, simultaneously learn from that, but also we're just in such a different time and era with social media. And Molly, as you mentioned, I mean, so many people are focused on so many different issues, and we have so much information coming at us with the advent of social media. I think it's just a very different time to get anyone's particular focus just on nuclear weapons. I mean, I came into this work not really thinking about nuclear weapons. I was focused, I studied international relations and got my master's in peace building and conflict resolution. And I didn't really realize until I came to DC in 2016 to get my master's, and as I was doing a variety of internships and starting my career, I was realizing how nuclear weapons were woven throughout all of these different geopolitical issues I was working on. And so that is why I really got interested in it. I mean, I was studying Korea, Iran, Israel, Palestine, and even a lot of like the Africa and Africa work and work I was doing in like Southeast Asia. I was seeing the impacts of nuclear weapons everywhere, that, you know, in the places I was studying. And, you know, especially with Iran, Israel right now, I do a lot on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, the fear of nuclear weapons, it was just permeating everything that I was studying and I was working on. So I think it does show that, you know, nuclear weapons might not be the top issue on so many people's minds. How do we get to them through some of these other issues? I mean, I think reallocation of resources that I was talking about earlier. I think that is so important. It might be the most important strategy that we can use right now is, hey, imagine what it could be if we actually do prioritize healthcare instead of more, submarine sea launched cruise missiles. I think it really is a way to lean on that intersectionality and talk to people that like you don't have to give up work on all of these other issues. In fact, we do need to pursue all of that justice work on so many other issues and really just interweave how, the ballooning defense budget and nuclear deterrence is interwoven through that and doesn't truly, lead to an abundant life and what the possibilities could be if we reinvest in our priorities.
Yeah, I don't know how to follow that. I think you covered everything that I would say, Colleen. I think, one thing that I'm asked frequently, because a lot of my work with IPPNW is with our medical student network and other youth organizing groups, which in this world, in IPPNW's world, is, 18 to 25-year-olds about, is, aren't you just scaring people? You're just walking around and instilling fear in people, and why would you do that? And my response is always the threat is there. And I think it's our duty to give people the agency to act instead of waiting for the worst case scenario in a scenario that we're barreling towards to happen. Give people the agency to take action, give them the tools to then go from there. It's not just instilling fear for the sake of instilling fear. And I think to that end is that people are already scared. People were scared before this January. People in my generation and of people that are younger grew up in constant fear of the climate crisis, which we're seeing in front of our very eyes, getting worse and worse and worse every year. People are already scared by, threat of the fall of democracy in this country and in other places around the world. We're seeing a war that goes beyond our comprehension in Gaza right now. Forced starvation of an entire country, a population of peoples. People know that things aren't right. And I think nuclear weapons really, to my knowledge and to my frame of thinking, represent this kind of apex of violence that we're willing to accept. And it just flows down from there. So once you hit the nuclear weapons on the head, it makes sense of kind of everything else. Are we really willing to accept this world where nuclear weapons, threaten us every single day? A world where people go hungry when there's ample food, where people don't have healthcare in a country that's supposedly the most rich in the world. And really, it just flows from there. So I think how do we reach people and how do we build a mass movement is by talking to them about the things that they are scared of and by bringing in these human stories of what these weapons do. Again, these aren't abstract threats to life. We've seen their impacts for now going on 80 years now, both through Hiroshima and Nagasaki and through the decades and decades of devastating nuclear weapons tests, which, as Colleen said, the tests and wars that were fought throughout the Cold War, those are felt throughout the entire world. We might live in a bubble here where we are, but that doesn't mean that others do. And I think it's important for us to stand in solidarity with folks that, have faced the brunt of the nuclear age, and to really grapple with that. So might be kind of a dire note to end on, but I think that there's power in that, in recognizing that the world that we're living in right now is completely turned upside down and that we have the tools to deal with it. And the other thing about these weapons, just one actual final comment here, is that they're built by human beings. They're not some force of nature. The climate crisis is horrifying and is torpedoing out of our control. And the weapons, can be a solution to the climate crisis. All of the billions and billions and billions of dollars that we're wasting on them can be spent towards climate mitigation, towards a just transition, towards true human needs. And I think that's how we get people. Maybe we won't have another million people in Central Park next year, but hopefully we can build that groundswell of support of people, donating $5 or by writing a letter or by signing that FCNL action or by going to the UN once a year. We don't need people dedicating all of their time to this issue, but we need people to know about it and to say this matters. And I will take a stand against these weapons. This matters. and we go from there. So I think I'll get off my soapbox.
That was great. Thank you so much, Molly. And a few minutes ago, Joseph said, "Amen, Molly," in the chat. So, and I'm seeing lots of nods. So, I think we're all with you. Thank you both so much. Before we move to closing, I just want to re-up a person in the chat. Stan gave a response to the question about nuclear tax resisting. So I would want to read it out loud for folks who can't see the chat. Stan said, "Yes, I started out as a war tax resistor, but after marriage and moving back to the United States, I found it was not possible. So I decided to give as much to peace each year as the government takes for military use, which is close to 40% or so of taxes. So not a small amount. To nonviolent peace force, Friends peace teams, peace brigades, and Christian peacemaker teams, now community peacemaker teams, and formerly Peace Tax Fund. They are in hiatus at present, it seems." So thank you so much, Stan. And again, we will put all of those words in the resources in the follow-up if you would like to learn more. And speaking of learning more, I'm also going to put in the chat the link to learn more about our upcoming Pendle Hill events. And I will put two in the chat to highlight our upcoming events. The first one is also related to the theme of the anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if you are local to the Pendle Hill area and the Philadelphia region, we will be holding a artist reception and storytelling around Hiroshima Ghost, which is a piece of art on campus, and that will be on August 11th at 7:30 p.m. So you can learn more at this link in the chat. And then finally, our September Stephen Carey Memorial Lecture is with Max L. Carter, and the title is "Earthquake, Wind, and Fire: Seeking the Calm Center. What lessons can we learn from the work of those living through war and catastrophe in Palestine and Israel as they speak truth to power in the cause of just peace? How might their experience inform us as we seek a calm center in the eye of the storm?" So definitely continuing some of the themes that we brought up today, and that will be a hybrid event. So you can join from wherever you may be located. And Francis, nothing to add on your end in the barn, right?
Nothing to add. Thank you so much. We're really grateful to spend this time with you.
Great. Thank you all so much. And I will lead us into a moment of silence and invite you to log off when you feel led. Thank you so much for being with us today.